Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Vertical Space, a podcast at the intersection of technology and flight. We are your hosts, Jim Barry and Luka Tomjanovic, and here we look at the most important forces shaping the market of advanced air mobility, with a particular focus on why and how they matter to those building a business in this very exciting and growing industry.
Flight is necessarily enabled by technology. Whether it's technology that was available in a 1903 Dayton bicycle shop or advanced manufacturing processes and the software that allows a 787 to fly. So there's nothing new or novel about that. But what's different now is that for the first time, we're seeing a rapid infusion of cutting edge technology that's informing development in flight and flying machines.
Welcome back to The Vertical Space. Today we're talking to Pasha Saleh, Head of Corporate Development at Alaska Airlines. Pasha is one of those industry leaders with a rare combination of experience in startups, large aerospace corporations, and management consulting. And on top of that, he's an airline pilot who still flies 737s at Alaska. This diverse background makes for a really interesting perspective on the future of aviation, one that both recognizes current times as the new golden age of aviation, but also tempered with a sense of realism that's only known to those who are deep in the aviation trenches. Among other things, we talk about Alaska's commitment to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2040, technologies that will help decarbonize aviation, and the role of Alaska Star Ventures in helping the industry get there. Enjoy the conversation with Pasha. This episode of the Vertical Space podcast is brought to you by UAvionics. UAvionics is the leader in low size, weight, and power certified avionics for manned, unmanned, and advanced air mobility aircraft. Let UAvionics help you achieve your goals, whether that be type certification, airspace access, or beyond visual line of sight operations. UAvionics has certified and certifiable communications, navigation, and surveillance avionics for your aircraft. So head over to uavionics.com or Google it to see how you can start flying safer and move your platform forward into shared airspace.
Pasha Saleh is head of corporate development at Alaska Airlines, where he leads the airline's technology investment arm, Alaska Star Ventures, and supports senior leadership in areas of sustainability, operational efficiency, strategy, and emerging technology. Pasha began his business career as a consultant at McKinsey & Company and has served in executive roles across the aerospace industry in organizations ranging from Silicon Valley startups to large OEMs, including Boeing and Beechcraft. Pasha earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree from the University of California at Berkeley and did an MBA from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. He holds an airline transport pilot certificate with 7 type ratings and has over 8,000 hours of flight experience. Pasha, welcome to the show, and please say hello to Luka.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for having me. Nice to be here with you both.
Welcome, Pasha. Great to have you on.
All right, so I'm going to ask you a 2-part first question.
Okay.
So our obligatory first question, which I violated in our conversations with Chris Anderson, was, is there anything that very few in the industry agree with you on? But Pasha, if it's okay with you, I'd also like to ask you about your meeting with Jimmy Doolittle, which you had years ago. So if you don't mind answering one or the other first, and if you don't mind, tell our audience who Jimmy Doolittle is, because all of them may not know. I think it's a cool story.
Sure. Well, I'll start with your first question. Nice to start with a challenging question right off the bat. So with respect to anything that few industry agree with me on, I'm sure there's a lot of things, but in general, I try not to hold too many controversial positions. As a general theme, I think you'll find me to be more on the bearish side than most in the industry with respect to what advancements I believe will be realized in a given time frame. And that's not at all to say that I don't believe that the capabilities or value of emerging aerospace technology is there. It's just that I think my view on what by when seems a little bit more grounded in pragmatism and maybe an appreciation of the inertia surrounding the status quo. You asked about Jimmy Doolittle. That was a very special experience for me. And so who was Jimmy Doolittle? Jimmy Doolittle was a true American hero. He was arguably the greatest aviator of all time. Jimmy had this rare combination of talent and ability. I don't think it's ever seen before or since in this field. He really had this ideal blend of practical can-do He was a barnstorming pilot, but he also had this academic erudition. So early in his career, Jimmy Doolittle broke all kinds of world records in air racing and distance and speed records in aircraft. He successfully flew some of the most dangerous airplanes in the world and was, one of the few that survived some of these early aircraft. But then he went on to receive the first ever PhD in aeronautics awarded by MIT. So, it's kind of hard to reconcile a person with that range of ability. He worked as an executive at Shell Oil, where he was responsible for the development of high-octane fuels that we use in aviation. And somewhere along the way, he managed to execute the world's first blind flight and successfully flew and landed an airplane by instruments alone. And that, of course, paved the way for commercial aviation to become, a viable means of transportation. Jimmy had an amazing military career. He's probably best known for commanding the daring 1942 raid over Tokyo. And that's when he led a group of 16 B-25 bombers. They took off from an aircraft carrier. With his knowledge of aeronautics, he personally directed the redesign of these airplanes to make them light enough to take off from an aircraft carrier. And they bombed downtown Tokyo in response to the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was a major morale-building moment in American history, as America was entering the global conflict. So Jimmy was my childhood hero. And when I was 16 years old, I wrote him a letter letting him know that. And surprisingly, he invited me to visit him at his retirement home in Carmel, California. He was 92 years old. I was 16 years old. But when I went to see him, he was still sharp as a tack. We sat there for over an hour, and I asked him, all about the early days of aviation. This guy was born in 1896, and the part he played in developing the modern industry. I was specifically interested to know about that raid over Tokyo, which was really a one-way trip in which the airmen were expected to bail out of their airplanes once the fuel was depleted. There was no way to land a bomber back on an aircraft carrier. And some of these folks, they bailed out over communist China, Manchuria, other hostile territories, and had no clear way of making their way back home. Many were captured. It was an incredible mission. So I asked him, how do you convince young men to go on such a risky, maybe even suicidal, you could consider, mission? And what he told me affected my view of leadership to this very day. He told me that the boys, as he called them, he said to the boys that this was going to be a very dangerous mission. And if they didn't want to go, there would be absolutely no shame in it. But then he added that he would be the first pilot off the deck. And after he said that, he went around the room and every single candidate that he'd selected chose to go. That told me, in no uncertain terms, that the genuine leadership involves being willing to do whatever it is you're asking of your team, in this case, up to and including your own, near certain demise. Doolittle was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for that mission, and he retired as a 4-star general. Just an absolutely amazing human being.
Yeah, remarkable story. And can you imagine the kinds of milestones that were achieved during his lifetime, from the first flight in 1903, crossing of the Atlantic in 27, breaking the sound barrier in 47, ultimately landing on the moon? What a great period for
Incredible.
aviation. Yeah. I often think of Doolittle, actually, because he, as you mentioned, he's the first one who really introduced this concept of an engineer and pilot, ushered the era of instrument flying. Reliance on instruments only grew from that point on. I think the simulator started to be introduced. So I often wonder, who are the Doolittles of advanced air mobility, or, quote, right? And what is the equivalent of instruments that this next era of aviation is going to pioneer?
Exactly.
That is a great story. I met one of the raiders, one of the last raiders, Pasha, a couple of years ago. And I don't know if they've all gone now. And
Sadly,
I also remember
they have.
They have. Pasha, tell me also, wasn't that expected? Didn't they think they failed initially?
Absolutely. Jimmy himself thought he was going to be court-martialed. He was really nervous as he made his way back. He was, it took him months to make his way back to the U.S., but he returned as a hero to his own surprise.
That's a great story. So tell us about your role as head of corporate development at Alaska Airlines. Very cool. You seem to have a really unique role in a terrific airline.
It's true. So this is a new function at Alaska Airlines, and I'm very fortunate to hold the inaugural role. Having been in business for 90 years, clearly Alaska Airlines has been doing the work of corporate development, but we just recently formalized it. And we did so with an eye to bringing a structured approach to diversifying revenue streams and identifying the new white space growth opportunities, everything it is that you guys are here talking about. going forward for the next 90 years, we recognize that there's going to be tremendous changes, and so this role was really stood up to capture some of those opportunities. It's a highly cross-functional role. Ultimately, the idea here is to identify these opportunities, deliver them to the relevant business units within the airline, and then help cultivate them and help them to thrive and grow within the enterprise. That's the way we're treating our corporate development function.
That's very cool, Pasha. So how is it similar, this role, how is it similar or dissimilar to similar roles in other airlines or other companies?
So I'm not directly familiar with similar roles at other airlines, but I can tell you that where we're starting from is more of a business development position. We want to build internal capabilities and skill sets so that we can over time engage in a greater number of transactions. So you might call it a crawl, walk, run approach.
So if I were to go to another airline, what title would I be looking for? Would it be the same title? It's just that your role is quite different.
It probably would. Alaska, we're a scrappier airline than most. You'll find people here wearing multiple hats. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that at Alaska, in an equivalent role, is probably doing twice as much as a competitor airline. And so I think if you look at that role at other airlines, you'll find more of a traditional investment banking background. Whereas for me, I'm approaching it more from business development, finding the opportunities, and then the actual deal execution. Right now, we're working with other fund partners, and over time we want to gain that skill set. So it's not that we have gone out and hired an army of bankers, not yet.
So if your venture were to be very successful in the next 3 years, what's the added value to Alaska, to your customers, and to your Alaska's investors?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the added value, it's going to be manifold for our employees, customers, investors. What we're doing will help ensure that our business continues to thrive, for the next 90 years into this new era, by making sure that we earn the privilege to carry our guests. We need to demonstrate prudent environmental stewardship. We're the only airline that's headquartered on the West Coast. Our guests are deeply passionate about environmental sustainability, and the trends that we're seeing starting out of Europe, we believe are going to affect our markets first. So in this role, we want to make sure that while we maintain our extreme safety records, we also want to seek benefits of new technology just as soon as they become viable. We don't want to sit around and wait and say, well, this is now a thing. Let's see if this is a fit for us. We want to actually create that future. And so what that will mean is that we'll continue to compete our enterprise by doing what we've always done, being early adopters of technology. And that's really what's allowed us to compete against giants.
So on that point, you talked about how airlines never compete on safety. Does the same hold true for carbon emissions?
A great question. So the imperative to decarbonize, has strong parallels with the safety mandate. And that's the mandate that's really at the heart of the entire airline and aerospace industry, as you both well know. With respect to safety, it has always been, will always be the absolute guiding virtue. There's no question about that. Every airline strives to be the absolute safest it can be, and no OEM would ever compete on safety. Even when disaster strikes, you will never find a competitor pointing the finger saying, see, you should have bought our platform. We all know that the most important thing in this business is winning the confidence of the flying public. Because at the end of the day, each time an airplane takes off and lands, it's a very unlikely bit of physics at work, is what I always say. The history of progress, in aviation, it's been marked by enough tragedy that no one involved would ever dare point the finger at a competitor, knowing full well it could just as easily have been them. So with respect to carbon removal, decarbonization, the threat now has become an existential one. We're just now beginning as a society to understand and really appreciate the impact of human activity on the planet. Aviation in particular, whether it's fair or not, has been singled out as a particularly egregious offender. Even though the total impact of commercial aviation on greenhouse gases is something around 3% or less, it's perceived to be much higher than that. And that's what matters. And that could have to do with the fact that contrails are highly visible, or just the sheer size of airplanes themselves. You look at that as a layman and say that thing has to be polluting considerably. So whatever's the case, something has to be done. We don't want to end up like the cigarette industry in the future. So decarbonization now, to me, presents a similar threat to commercial aviation as does safety. And so it's not in anyone's interest to differentiate and compete on that basis. Instead, we have to find a way to work together as an industry to solve some of these very challenging problems, but they're not intractable problems, and we need to do that while there's still time.
There was this significant step change in how people think about decarbonizing aviation over the last, call it 2.5 years, especially in Europe, where the sentiment is even stronger. In your opinion, what was the origin?
Yeah, it's true. It took us all by surprise. I don't know that I could pin down a precise origin. The flight shaming movement that came out of Sweden with Greta Thunberg and the tremendous vain activism she tapped into, that was a catalytic moment for sure. I think Europe in general has just been far more progressive on these issues than we have. They have alternatives that we don't have. They have trains that actually work. They have distances that aren't as vast between population centers as in our country. So it sort of makes more sense that this would have originated in Europe. And I think Greta had a lot to do with how quickly it spread. But I think we were all surprised. I know we were all surprised that during COVID, it really became an urgent imperative here in our country.
Tell us about Alaska's commitment to reach net zero carbon by 2040. How is it unique and what's your path forward?
Yeah, so thank you for asking that. It's unique in that it's 10 years ahead of the general industry. 2050 is the date that you see out there, and it's extremely ambitious. There's no question about that. It's an ambitious goal. We have a plan to achieve it. That doesn't mean that we know all the answers just yet. And in fact, that's one of the reasons we've set up this venture fund that I'll chat with you guys about here later today. But the plan, it's a 5-part plan. And so we've really broken down the pieces we need to get to net zero by 2040 into these categories. The first is operational efficiency. We want to make sure that we're operating the assets that we do have currently as efficiently as possible. So that includes things like encouraging single engine taxi wherever it's safe and practical, using preconditioned air at the airports to minimize the APU runtime. We've partnered with a company called Aerospace Intelligence to enhance the efficiency of the routes that we fly. All those things. I'm happy to say that we're already extremely operationally efficient. So when we went through and came up with an exhaustive list of initiatives, there weren't a whole lot of things that we hadn't been doing. Even things like, that may seem extreme, loading aircraft to the aftmost CG limit to minimize aerodynamic drag from the control surface downforce. Things like that are taken and have already been going on. So it actually made me proud as we turned over these rocks and said, oh, we're doing that. There's certain things that we don't do because we perceive the safety benefit to outweigh the environmental benefit. Example of that is idle reverse thrust. So that's an initiative where you could train pilots to use idle thrust on rollout and rely on braking. Well, that may work for some airlines, that only land on 12 or 14,000 foot runways. But in our operation, you could be landing on a 13,000 foot runway at Denver one day, and the next day you're on a 6,000 foot or less strip covered in snow in Alaska. And so we want to make sure the pilots have the muscle memory of max reverse thrust and not relying on brakes. So there are things unique to our operation where we say, yeah, we thought of that, but we also have to make a safety case for everything we do. So operational efficiency is the first bucket of our 5-part path. The next is fleet renewal. We've been on an all Boeing fleet for a very long time. When we acquired Virgin America, they had an all Airbus fleet. And so now we have a mixed fleet, but the decision was made to move back to an all Boeing fleet. And with that decision, what that means is that we have orders. We just finalized orders for up to 120 new 737 MAX aircraft. And each of those airplanes is 25% more efficient than the 737NG that it replaces. It's absolutely incredible. So fleet renewal will go a long way to helping us on our path to net zero. The third bucket is SAF, sustainable aviation fuel. It's a safe, certified fuel. It can be blended with traditional fuel. And every single gallon of SAF that we use has up to 80% less carbon emission on a life cycle basis than traditional jet fuel does. So we recently launched a partnership with Microsoft to use SAF to offset the carbon impact of their employee travel. We're looking at other creative relationships with corporate customers that way. But the reality is there's just not enough SAF right now, and it's not available at any viable cost to scale it. So it's going to require government support and collaboration with producers in order for it to to make a meaningful difference. But we believe that SAF is really the great hope. The next
Pasha,
category is what we are calling novel propulsion. So that's essentially using electric, hybrid electric, hydrogen, powering aircraft with other than fossil fuels. We think that that can be viable for regional aircraft by 2040, maybe even sooner. And recently we launched a partnership with Zero Avia, who are leaders in the space of hybrid electric hydrogen fuel cell propulsion. And we contributed one of our de Havilland Q400 76-seat turboprops to be converted to hydrogen power over the next few years. That's a super exciting program that I'm leading at Alaska. The last step in our 5-part path is carbon offsets. And so we want to use carbon offsets only to plug the gap to net zero. So, aviation is really one of the hardest sectors to decarbonize. So we need credible offsets to close that gap, but we don't want to go there until we've exhausted all the other options I discussed.
Pasha, what are your thoughts on the timelines for SAF?
Well, it's really hard to say. Right now, it is so minuscule, the volume that's available. I think it's going to be a very long, I really think it's going to be a decade or more until we can even get up to 10%, say, SAF consumption. A lot of that has to do with the availability of feedstocks. Some of the feedstocks produce problems in and of themselves. There's just a lot to be resolved. And in our case, we sort of are at a disadvantage as Alaska Airlines being on the West Coast because the major pipelines are all in the Midwest. And so there's this West Coast premium that we also face in getting SAF. But nevertheless, we're fully committed to it.
Pasha, as you outline the 5, are there one or two that most stand out that may have the greatest impact?
I think, taken in concert, we're going to get there by doing all of these things at the same time. Really, we're turning over every rock. But to your question, I was startled that SAF could result in up to 80% less carbon emission. That's just a staggering number, because at the end of the day, you're still burning fuel, you're still emitting, you still have emissions coming out the tailpipe. So just intuitively, I wouldn't have thought that we could get that much. But so much of the environmental impact of fossil fuel is from the extraction of the fuel and actually processing it as a fuel. And so when you eliminate that part, that's how you get to it. You still are burning fuel, you're still emitting, you're still polluting to some extent, but that's a dramatic reduction. And again, it's not that there's any one silver bullet. The fleet renewal is also something that surprised me. With an airplane like the 737 that's over 60 years old, really, I was stunned that this latest iteration, the MAX, which is a fantastic airplane, could be 25% more efficient on a per seat basis than the NG, which was already really super fuel efficient compared to its predecessor, the classic 737s. So just when you think you've hit the wall aerodynamically, the geniuses at the OEMs come out with and the engine manufacturers pull these miracles out of the hat. Having said that, I've spent a lot of time with GE, and I understand that the turbine engine technology truly is reaching its limits. The modern engines are operating at core temperatures that are hotter than the melting point of the metals they're made of. I mean, think about that for a moment. I don't like to think about that when I'm flying the aircraft, but it's this, infinitesimally
it's a great confidence builder
thin,
for the
it's this
passenger.
vapor barrier that's separating the heat from the can of the engine, which would literally liquefy if they were to come in contact. So
right.
We're really producing magic out there. I don't think the general public is aware of the inventiveness that's gone into modern air travel and making it as both as safe and as hyper efficient as it really is.
If you look at the goal of reaching net zero carbon emissions by 2040, what's a rough split between what can be realized in-house versus those solutions that require global airline and perhaps even cross-industry commitments?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I don't know that I could put a specific percentage on it, but my instinct tells me that the lion's share of the benefit is going to come from the latter, the cross-industry collaboration. There's only so much we can do in-house. We've already been doing it. We're pedaling as hard as we can, but it's really going to take governments and all kinds of stakeholders, industry lobbies coming together and getting serious about this. And it's starting to happen.
Right. Yeah. And the reason I'm asking is not too long ago, I was attending virtually a seminar, and there was discussions about some of the low-hanging fruit for decarbonizing aviation, and air traffic management obviously was a prime example of it. And people claim that you could achieve high single digit, low double digit improvements in carbon emissions by very, very simple optimization of routes, climbs, descents, optimal flight levels, etc. Yet it seems like even that is receiving a lot of headwind in executing because of the number of stakeholders involved, the age of some of the systems that are in the ATM infrastructure.
It's true. I mean, this goes back to the challenges of next gen. The
Exactly.
promise was so great, and what was actually delivered was so disappointing for that very reason.
Tell us about Star Ventures. And does Star Ventures have any role to play in getting to net zero by 40?
Oh, very much so. So Alaska Star Ventures is our newest corporate subsidiary. And it was formed just a few months ago. As the only airline headquartered on the West Coast, Alaska Airlines is uniquely positioned to tap into all the tremendous innovation that's occurring in this part of the country, everywhere from Silicon Valley up to our own Puget Sound backyard. Alaska Airlines also has a tremendous heritage of innovation that goes all the way back to our roots in 1932. We're operating in some of the harshest and most unforgiving environments on Earth. And so I think that history really shaped our culture. It's a scrappy, resilient, self-reliant culture. And it's resulted in Alaska Airlines being responsible for several advents that ended up becoming de facto industry standards. For example, you may be aware Alaska created RNP, which is the technology that uses GPS for air navigation. That's the standard across the world today, and most people think NASA might have come up with it, but it was actually Alaska Airlines trying to find a safer way to get in and out of Juneau and other terrain and weather-challenged airports. We were also the first airline to sell tickets on the internet. Today, it's hardly imaginable that there's ever any other way you could buy a ticket, like actually go into a ticket office, whatever that is. And so the list of industry-shaping innovations that our airline has pioneered just goes on and on. So Alaska Star Ventures, being our newest corporate entity, it's intended to expand on that tradition. It's intended to build tentacles into Silicon Valley and elsewhere that aviation innovation is taking place, and really make sure that we continue to be early adopters of the new technology. It's been a while since our last big breakthrough, and we're hoping that by setting up this venture arm, we can be very closely connected to the cutting edge. Incidentally, the name is one I came up with, and our CEO liked it and selected it. It goes back to the original operating certificate of Alaska Airlines. It was called Alaska Star Airlines in 1932. And so I thought it would be kind of cool if the newest
a great homage
had a name in common with the earliest one. And the logo had a North Star, and that's still it's still on all of our pilot wings, that North Star.
As you formed Star Ventures, what technologies were in your gut where you thought this has got to work and this has to be a part of Alaska's future and potentially something that'll help towards net 40? What were things based on your really unique and distinguished past, Pasha? Which ones were you pretty convinced you were going to bring forward?
I had a strong feeling that it wasn't going to be so much hardware based, and I know that gets a lot of more of the media attention. It's really cool to look at eVTOLs and flying cars and futuristic looking aircraft on TV or in a magazine, but software is sort of the unsung hero. It was really clear to me that the advances that are happening in machine learning and AI, the ability to parse massive data sets and gain meaningful insights. And this comes from some of the work I did in strategy at Boeing, where we were trying to, if you think about a Boeing airplane, the engines alone generate terabytes of data on a single flight. Mm-hmm. And, there was this hope that we could use that information to do preventive maintenance, to inform a mechanic to replace a part long before it failed, predictive maintenance. And it has proven incredibly challenging to take signal from all that noise, but nevertheless, it's happening. It's just now. So we're at the cusp. I really feel that today we are where the internet was, say, 20 years ago when it comes to AI and machine learning. If you can think back to the first time you realized that you could go on the internet and buy a pair of shoes, and that moment, like, this is a thing. That's how I feel we are right now as the dawn of AI and machine learning. So whereas, call it, 8 years ago when I was at Boeing, we thought, wouldn't it be cool if we could look through that terabyte of data and say, hey, this fuel pump is going to fail in the next 200 hours. Let's change it now. It wasn't quite possible, but we're starting to get there. And so for me, my sense was that through Alaska Star Ventures, we could find some of the most innovative companies that are doing things like that, bring them into our operation first, and not necessarily have to go out and buy new hardware or change the fleet we operate, but just get a lot more out of it.
So what do you look for in a company?
So just to be clear, when we set up Alaska Star Ventures, our board authorized us to set up this entity exclusively for the purpose of accelerating our path to net zero. So it's quite a targeted focus. I mean, it's going to be anything from SAF to carbon capture and sequestration technology, the software I just described for facilitating operational efficiency. It could be aerodynamic devices like strakes or new blended winglets. So it's still, it's a broad spectrum, but exclusively focused on net zero. We don't have license to go out and invest at the moment outside of that.
Artificial intelligence, that made a lot of news, your partnership there. I'm assuming that what they're doing is somewhat typical of the kind of companies you're going to invest in. You want to talk a little bit about what was the problem that they're addressing and how they're executing on that?
Yes. So aerospace intelligence,
Yes, aerospace intelligence.
It's a perfect example of what I was just describing. So when we met this team, there were just 3 people, and they've since grown to over 50 people. They have offices in multiple continents. But again, 3 people walked into our building and represented their company, fledgling company. And that team was initially had no idea that they'd be building an aviation business. They were focused on building software for self-driving cars. So they were only looking at airlines as a potential future adjacency. If this thing takes off, maybe we can serve shipping, maybe we can serve airlines. And so they came to have a look at our network operations center, which is the 24-hour nerve center of the airline where we plan the flights and track all the flights. And immediately they looked at these, I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but like the 1980s era, practically DOS green screens, and thought, oh my God, this is how airlines, and just to be clear, I am told that we have the state-of-the-art network operations center. It was just recently built. So the technology, as outdated as I'm describing, is still the top in the airline industry. So these guys looked at that and they immediately recognized that there's a need for a modern solution to routing air traffic. And they also understood that in many ways, it was an easier, let's call it more manageable problem to solve than self-driving cars. Airlines provide advance notice of movements, in the form of a flight plan. The national airspace system is generally highly organized. It's predictable. When you compare that with the randomness of a self-driving car going down, say, a street in San Francisco with a kid crossing the street and a ball rolling in the middle of traffic, far more manageable problem to solve. So immediately they pivoted. And over the course of the last 2.5 years, the team worked side by side with our dispatchers. They literally camped out 24/7 in our network center and watched how flight plans are developed, the challenges, the pain points. And so it was a really symbiotic relationship. It could never have happened if our company was operating in a typical, client vendor type relationship. So the deep experience that we brought with 90 years of routing airplanes around the sky helped inform their technical solution. And at the end of the day, developed, a product that could never have been achieved any other way. We didn't make a financial investment in aerospace intelligence, but it was a turning point that led to the creation of Alaska Star Ventures, because it pointed out to us how much value there is to be closely connected with these startups that are on the leading edge of technology. And if we can have a role in shaping them, guiding them, they'll get there a lot faster than they would on their own, and a solution that's tailor-made for us. So it's actually a perfect example of the way we're planning to work with our portfolio companies in the future.
Pasha, what advice would you give to a person starting or running a smaller company, let's say in aviation, aerospace, or in advanced air mobility?
I would say start with a large fortune, as the old joke goes. No, in all seriousness, I would say have a clear-eyed perspective on certification and adoption timelines. So many of the investors in this sector are coming from traditional tech backgrounds, and there's nothing at all wrong with that. But I think aerospace timelines are inherently different. And in fact, anything, quote unquote, disruptive, that's virtually unheard of in this environment, where the name of the game has always been slow, steady, evolutionary, not revolutionary progress. That's never been the case in aerospace. So investors who haven't grown up around that space may have a clouded perception of what success is, or even, if they're making any relative progress at all. Earlier in my career, I was a senior strategist at the Boeing company. And I remember distinctly that during my first week on the job, it was announced that a senior leader of the strategy org was retiring after about 30 years with Boeing. So I immediately sent an email. I think it may have been my first email from my Boeing email account, and congratulating them on their retirement, but also asking if they would have time to meet with me to see if I could glean a little bit of wisdom as I started my own career in that role. And so he was gracious enough to give me some time as he was packing out his office. And the first thing I noticed in his office was this large poster of a giant container ship. And there was a tiny little tugboat down by the side of it, tiny in proportion. And so I asked, I said, hey, you're an airplane guy. Why do you have this ship thing in your office? And he said that he keeps that image in every office he's had because it reminds him of the role of strategy in large companies. And I said, what do you mean? He said, I'm the tugboat and Boeing is the container ship. And by applying steady, continuous, unwavering pressure or, influence, the direction of that giant ship eventually alters by a few degrees over time. It wasn't exactly what I wanted to hear on day one, starting this job. It was inspiring, but it stuck with me, and I came to appreciate what that meant. You don't make dramatic changes in something this complex where the stakes are so high. But he also said something else that stuck with me. Boeing, Airbus, Embraer, really any aerospace company that's had long-term success, been around a while. They never, ever have the latest, greatest technology, and they never will. And in fact, their technology is generally 10 or more years obsolete by the time it goes into production. And that's by design. And I remember this same executive telling me, when Apple releases its newest iPhone, you wouldn't want your family flying on it. And there's a lot of wisdom in that. It may sound bleak and pessimistic at first, but it goes right to the heart of why our industry has such a remarkable safety record, in spite of the fact that we pull off, as I call it, this greatest trick of physics every day. Like it works mathematically, but when you watch a 747 lift off the ground, you sort of scratch your head and say, that shouldn't work. And so, that's the advice I'd give to someone starting out. The timelines to develop something are going to be shockingly longer than you expect, and there's good reason for it.
And I have to ask a follow-up to that, Pasha. You mentioned up front that this is one of the things that the industry disagrees with you on, the time frame for adoption of these technologies. So what are your views on the timelines?
Yeah, so as you know, it's impossible to nail down any kind of timeline with accuracy. But if we're just talking about the airline industry, I really think that 5, even 10 years from now, it will be ostensibly similar to the way it looks right now. From a passenger perspective, the effects of COVID, they'll be long gone. But what will be unseen is how much progress will actually have been made behind the scenes. And by that, I mean, validating, trialing all these technologies that the three of us are excited about, that the AM industry is all about. These are things that are going to lead us to a net zero future. But even 10 years from now, I don't see day-to-day air travel being dramatically different, and again, don't mean to be pessimistic, but just realistic about what I've seen. In my sales career at Beechcraft, I saw how hard it was to add winglets to an airplane that had been in production for 40 years. That was a multi-year process just to add winglets. So disruptive things, it just strikes me as it's going to be a while. But, there's so much low-hanging fruit. There is just so much to be fixed. If you look at ramp operations, virtually nothing has changed in 40 years. You're still relying on marshalers with wands to signal airplanes in, when this could all be self-guided, could be automated. And there's trials. All of that is happening right now. But for this to be the de facto standard at airports across the world, that's what I mean will be a decade or more.
Those are good points. Do you think now is a good time to start an airline?
I think it's the perfect time to start a new airline. If ever there was a time, this is it.
What makes you think that?
Because if you have to start a new airline today, you don't have to unentrench legacy mindsets. You could surround yourself with a team of like-minded people. You could get the latest, greatest technology. Unlearning is harder than learning in so many ways. And so being on the cusp of all these breakthroughs, again, they might not go into immediate effect, but if you're building an airline around what the future will look like, there hasn't been a lot to be excited about on the horizon for quite a long time. Mm-hmm. And now there is.
You have a really, really interesting and unique mix of backgrounds, from strategy to being an airline executive and of course a pilot, armed with that background, what problems are you running into that make you go, wait a second, there's got to be a better way? You talked about maybe ramp operations as you're pulling in with your 737, but are there any that stand out in the recent past that made your eyebrow go up?
Yeah, ramp actually is a great place to start. As you know, when you're in the air, there's only so much you can do to optimize the route. You're at the mercy of the air traffic control system. That's a legacy system that we could have an entire separate podcast on the opportunities there. But there's so much inefficiency that happens on the ground. I think I would focus a lot on ground operations at hub airports and outstations. Airlines have more of an ability to control their destiny. And yet it's chaos. It is absolute chaos. And from a customer or passenger perspective, it's far more frustrating to arrive at your destination 10 or 20 minutes early and then deplane 20 minutes late because you sat there waiting for a gate or there was congestion in some ramp or alleyway. A lot of these things can be solved with technology that exists today. I was speaking with the CEO of a company yesterday that's looking at using cameras, the cameras that already exist at all the ramp locations, but using computer vision and applying that with AI and making inferences on when things are happening, flagging when things are falling behind, something that would take the equivalent of an army of people around each aircraft hardstand. And so I think that's a great place to start with tools that are being developed that exist today and that don't have, again, the certification hurdles of call it a new eVTOL that aren't going to have to go through years of rigorous testing in that way, but will have very high payback periods.
The podcast, The Vertical Space, is about the intersection of technology and flight. What tech in aviation has worked, what hasn't, and what problems need to be solved by tech in the future?
Yeah, so flight is necessarily enabled by technology. Whether it's technology that was available in a 1903 Dayton bicycle shop, or advanced manufacturing processes and the software that allows a 787 to fly. So there's nothing new or novel about that. But what's different now is that for the first time, we're seeing a rapid infusion of cutting edge technology that's informing development in flight and flying machines. As I mentioned with my Boeing example, there's nothing ever cutting edge about the stuff that OEMs are putting out. Today, that is the actual intent. So the problems that will be solved in the future will be those that push the industry to new frontiers of efficiency. And much of that, again, is coming from what I talked about, AI, machine learning, the ability to parse massive data sets, get that signal from the noise. I'm less bullish on near-term, quote, breakthroughs on the hardware side because of the cert hurdles and other factors.
We talked a little bit about advanced air mobility. I'm gonna say drones, eVTOL, and the like. What are the forces driving AAM? Is it the capability or is it the need being addressed?
So from my perspective, environmental sustainability is now the key driving force, and it will be. The COVID pandemic allowed an opportunity for the aviation industry to rethink all of our processes and to challenge assumptions. It also aligned with what we discussed earlier, quickly intensifying public pressure to decarbonize. So the promise of advanced air mobility, whether it's autonomous package delivery, drones, eVTOLs, whatever it is, it'll have to align with a vision for sustainable, infinitely sustainable future of flight. This has to be something that can go on both economically sustainable and environmentally. And that wasn't so clearly entrenched in the initial value proposition of AAM, which was more broadly, deliver more value to society. That can't be the case anymore unless environmental responsibility point, has been clearly proven.
Pasha, tell us a little bit more about advanced air mobility. How are airlines going to benefit? In what timeframes? What's the value to the public and the like?
Yeah, so despite certain recent public announcements from airlines, I don't see traditional airlines benefiting from advances in eVTOLs or drones in the near or midterm future. But instead, where airlines will benefit is when regional airline fleets become retrofitted with electric or hybrid powertrains. New and green regional airline platforms are being developed today, and entirely new regional air networks are being considered. So the opportunity now exists to take advantage of. There are nearly 5,000 underutilized airports across America, and so for the first time, we could actually deliver a regional air transport network that functions as the way it was envisioned in the days before airline deregulation. So it's entirely possible that advances in AAM, as they affect regional aircraft, we could start to see point-to-point flights between hundreds of cities, connecting smaller communities where previously you had to you fly through hubs, and it would take all day to get to somewhere you could drive more quickly. And so that's something that I think airlines will pay attention to in the AAM space before the flying cars or the drones or the eVTOLs enter the business model. And there's a lot of value to the traveling public. I recently was co-author on a NASA white paper on regional air mobility, and in that paper, we pointed out the benefits to the traveling public of activating this incredible resource that we have, these thousands of untapped airports. The NASA study showed that only 30 airports in America, 30 airports, serve 70% of all travelers. And most Americans live within 16 minutes of an airport. And yet only 1% of trips that are up to 500 miles are taken by air. People would rather drive. And it's not surprising. It's because unless you happen to live near a hub city, or your origin or wherever you want to go is near one, it's a major inconvenience. You have to take multiple flights, connect in a hub. And so you end up driving. But all of this would go away if we were to invest in a new generation of small, call it 20-seaters or less, that are efficient, that are electric, that are sustainable, and that use this built-in pre-existing airport infrastructure that we have.
We had Chris Anderson on last week, Pasha, and he wrote the book The Long Tail. So speaking of the long tail, take advantage of all these other airports that are available to be able to service these smaller communities that are largely getting shut out right now.
Yes, exactly.
So Pasha, listen, you have a very unique past with your work at McKinsey and the like. So tell us about that unique path and how does it shape how you're thinking today?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I recognize that my path to the work I'm doing today is an unconventional one. Steve Jobs gave a famous speech at Stanford where he said that you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. And that's something that I really relate to. And he also said you have to trust that these dots will somehow connect. And so at several points in my career, I've made leaps of faith, by dramatically changing direction and not at all knowing where it was going to take me. But I was just guided by a sense that it was the right thing to do for professional development, personal fulfillment, and just continuing to grow. And so the first of those moments was walking away from an airline pilot career, which is what I'd wanted to do since I was a little kid. And after nearly a decade, I'd finally been accepted to fly for the major airlines, which was at that time Continental Airlines. I still loved flying airplanes as much as I ever did, but I knew that I had more to offer. I just wanted more out of my career, but I didn't know exactly what that was. So I chose to return to school and completed my MBA at the University of Chicago. And that decision was really the beginning of a tremendous broadening of opportunities, whereas continuing down the same career track is generally a narrowing experience. And so the University of Chicago experience led me directly to McKinsey. And at that point, not only did my knowledge and of the industry that I'd spent my entire career in dramatically expand, but so did my professional network, the skills I had, my career options. So I won't go into all the twists and turns of my career journey, but today I find myself in this unique position where I can draw on all that diverse experience, from the operational knowledge of walking in an airline pilot's shoes with 8,000 hours of flying airliners around, with a toolkit that comes from being a management consultant. What you learn from strategy at a place like Boeing, having the privilege of seeing where the world's largest OEM is placing their bets in the next 50 years. Also, what it feels like to work at a startup in Silicon Valley environment. These are such different experience. I had a sales career and the interpersonal skills that I was able to hone doing that. And so I bring all of those skills to bear every day here, helping Alaska Airlines navigating this AAM space, because there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of hype, but there's also a lot of really interesting things going on. And so I feel fortunate that this diverse experience gives me that perspective where I can help kind of sift through all that.
I'm amazed by what you've done, and I'm really curious to see over the next couple of years how you're going to change not only Alaska, but how you're going to change the industry.
Thanks.
So very exciting. So let's fast forward 5-10 years. What does the industry look like? You've already painted a pretty good picture, Pasha, but is there anything else you want to round out?
On the surface, the industry probably looks pretty similar. You're going to see pilot programs popping up here and there with advanced technologies. We hope that many of them you see will be right here with Alaska Airlines. We've got big plans that I'd love to sit down with you guys in the future and share some of those. But up in the state of Alaska, it's sort of an ideal proving ground for technology. It's sparsely populated. The environment is, the weather is harsh, so it's a great place to prove out technology to their limits. And so I think as 5-10 years in the future, you'll have seen really exciting futuristic pilot programs that have popped up all around the world, and several of those will be starting to make their way into mainstream operations. Maybe not quite by that point yet, but we'll have learned a lot at that point.
What's the most common misconception or misunderstanding on the topic of what we discussed?
I really think for the general public, the most common misconception is that the development timeline for new aerospace technology that you read about in the press, autonomous aircraft, flying cars, that will progress along the lines of things that most consumers are familiar with, like automobiles, computers, telecom devices. The advances we've seen in each of those categories that I just mentioned over the past few decades are staggering. And if you view them like you were talking about Jimmy Doolittle over the course of a single human lifetime, it's almost incomprehensible. But that same can't be said with respect to aviation. For all practical purposes, we're still flying at the same altitudes, the same speeds, and in the same manner that the very first jet airplanes did when they took off, 65 years ago? So batteries are a great example. Electric cars are suddenly popping up all over the place, right? So it could reasonably lead one to conclude that electric airplanes are just around the corner. But if you look at the evolution of the automobile, and my hobbies, I restore classic cars, so I'm a grease monkey on the weekends. But if you look at the evolution of a car, we had this period of roughly 100 years of fossil-fueled internal combustion engines, and then along came the Prius. Can you guys guess how long ago that was?
20 years.
Good guess. It was 25 years ago. But, most people say, Prius, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. It's been around for a quarter of a century. The first Prius was made in 1997. My point is that we had 100 years of internal combustion, then a quarter century of hybrid automobiles, and just now are electric cars really starting to become more mainstream. So we can expect a similar evolution in aviation. Only difference is the timeline will be much longer due to the stringent certification requirements that have to be met. You can't just pull over if something goes wrong in your hybrid or electric plane at 30,000 feet. And much of the advances in electric cars have been due to increases in energy density of lithium-ion batteries. But that battery chemistry is now 31 years old. It was commercialized by Sony with the Walkman in 91. And so we have to look to advanced chemistries, lithium sulfur, solid state batteries. All these things are in the works, and you'll see them in cars long before you see them in airplanes. The reason for that is that the FAA and other global regulators, they have a quarter of a century of experience, thanks to Sony Walkman, of studying lithium ion. The characteristics are extremely well known. How it behaves during thermal runaway scenarios, fire, explosion, all that. So as new advanced chemistries come on, and they'll have to come on to make airplanes feasible to be powered by batteries, it's going to take another enormous amount of time till they're just as well understood, and that the regulators can achieve that same level of comfort to say it's okay to stick them inside an airplane. And so lithium ion is rapidly reaching its limits with respect to energy density. It's just not enough to power a plane of any size over any useful distance. And so that's just one example of a common misconception, is that this is going on the surface. It's just a matter of time before we see it in the air. It is a matter of time, but a different, a lot longer time.
Pasha, one of the areas that we talked about was improved outcomes, is the value to the environment, especially as a result of your project your goal of by 2040. What other outcomes could come about, improved outcomes that could come about as a result of the intersection of technology and flight?
Well, if you think about flight, what are the improved outcomes that flight in general, if we just take a step back? I mean, you can't... The effects of the improvement of society, of human life, can't be exaggerated. Flight has really connected the world. It's made it possible for commerce to thrive across the planet. It's made it possible for fresh strawberries to be delivered to remote islands in Alaska in the winter. And so flight is nothing short of magical. I fell in love with it as a kid the same way I'm sure both of you did. And so as we infuse cutting edge technology, and again, that's the difference. It's never been cutting edge, because by the time it's out there, it's already obsolete. Now the pace of innovation is so much faster. Certification has been rewritten. When you think about what the FAA recently did with the rewrite, all of that is pointing in the right direction to allow us to more quickly capture and take these benefits. So I think it's just going to be an intensification of the benefits of flight is already provided. It's just going to make people even more closely connected. And it's been shown that when people can be connected, I mean, Zoom has been great to get through the pandemic, but I think all of us miss the human interaction that we had before. And so when we can find a way to fly more safely, more economically, sustainably, we'll do more of it. We'll see each other more often. Ideas will exchange minds more quickly, and the value to society, it's really immeasurable. So super exciting time. I call it a second golden age of flight.
It's terrific. And I love your comments about utilizing the 5,000 airports rather than just the 30.
Yes.
And think about what that could open up for travel and connections and the like. Is there anything we should have asked you that we haven't asked you that you'd like to talk about?
I'd like to mention, maybe just what being a pilot has meant to me. It's unusual for a pilot to be doing this role at an airline, and I'm incredibly grateful to our senior leadership team for taking a chance on me as a pilot to be in this role. But I think it's actually critical, and it's probably helps me see things a little bit differently. For me, being a pilot, it's more than a career experience that I've had. It's an identity. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of problem solving. And it has much in common with other highly technical fields that have critical outcomes, like medicine, being a surgeon. So being an airline pilot is where I started my career. But interestingly, when I moved into my first business job, which was a McKinsey consultant, I found that it was an ideal background to transition to that role. As an airline captain, I learned that the level of excellence that you should hold yourself to should be extraordinarily high. And that same level of rigor and discipline was expected at McKinsey. Also, the nature of teamwork was very similar. At McKinsey, we spoke about what we called the obligation to dissent. That means that even if you're a brand new junior associate, day one on the job, if you believe that something a senior partner has said is incorrect, or there's a flaw in their thinking or their reasoning or analysis, you don't only have the right to object, you're in fact obligated to do so. In other words, if you don't object, you're in dereliction of your duty to dare. And that goes right to the very heart of what crew resource management on a flight deck is all about. So I found that background was highly relatable to where I began my business career. So grateful that the company took a chance, put a pilot and took me out of the seat of the airplane, put me at the controls of this new enterprise.
So Pasha, you have a minute to summarize. You see somebody in the street and they say to you, "Hey, I heard you're going to be on the Vertical Space podcast," and they say, "Tell me in a minute what you talked about." What would you tell them?
Is that what people speak on the street, Jim?
Exactly. Someday. So what would you tell them, Pasha?
What the podcast was all about?
Yeah.
Well, I would say, first of all, listen to the podcast. A couple of cool, smart guys on it, and I enjoyed listening to all of your previous episodes. And I'm really honored to have been asked to be on it. So thank you for that. I would say that the message that I'd like to share is this is really and truly an exciting time in aviation. We can be realistic about timelines, but we should also appreciate that for the first time in many, many years, decades even, we're on the cusp of new technologies that are going to dramatically change the way that we fly, how often we fly, where we fly from, and the impact that our flying has, which is something that hasn't been considered, or at least adequately considered up to now. And so I'd say this is going to be a very exciting sector. Keep your eye on it. Be patient. Don't be cynical about it. Everything we do in here has to be absolutely safe, and it will be. And it's incredible to think that this is the safest way to go from point A to point B when you understand under the hood what really goes all into it. And so we're on the cusp of that second golden age. The original golden age of aviation was 1929 to 39, where, in response to government incentives, you had a massive amount of innovation come out. Right now, the incentive is sort of, this backdrop of environmental peril, but also this new technology that has come into our hands through cell phones, through connectivity, through computer enhancements in computing technology. And all of that is making its way into the way we fly. And so I would say listen to the other episodes of the podcast and listen for updates on the exciting developments that we bring to market.
Great way to end. Thanks a lot, Pasha, for being on the show. Really appreciate it.
I had a great time. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pasha.
All right, that's a wrap for today. Thank you for listening to the Vertical Space podcast. Reach out if there are topics that you would like us to discuss, and goodbye until the next episode. Unless mentioned, this podcast is in no way endorsing or promoting any person and or company mentioned, and all opinions within the podcast are solely that of the presenters. The Vertical Space makes no guarantees, warranty, or representation of any information given in this podcast. Any information given is for informational purposes and should be used at your own risk. This podcast is for general, educational, and entertainment purposes only.